when Managing Director Brad Thorne tossed a termination folder across the boardroom table, demanding I surrender $37 million in enterprise contracts. He thought he was executing a flawless corporate coup. He didn't realize that my clients had already signed a key man exit covenant 3 hours prior. 22 years ago, I walked through the glass doors of Vanguard Portfolio Tech as a mid-level account strategist when the firm was operating out of a cramped office in downtown Chicago. Back in 2004, at 27 years old, I took on the clients nobody else wanted. I spent 2 decades building our enterprise division from scratch, surviving tech bubble bursts, economic recessions, and 3 different software platform migrations. By 2026, at 49 years old, I served as the Senior Director of Enterprise Client Portfolios, overseeing $48 million in annual recurring revenue. Our core business revolved around customized enterprise infrastructure logistics and portfolio data architecture for major corporations. Out of the $48 million flowing into our corporate bank accounts every year, $37,440,000 came from just 4 Tier 1 enterprise clients. That represented 78% of the company's total annual revenue. These 4 accounts were not just line items on a spreadsheet. They were massive corporate entities: Apex Freight Group, Titan Global Logistics, North Star Retail Corp., and Beacon Supply Networks. I had negotiated every contract extension, handled every late-night operational escalation, and sat across the table from their chief executive officers for over 15 years. Leonard Ross, the chief executive officer of Apex Freight, once told me at a quarterly review that he didn't do business with Vanguard Portfolio Tech because of our software dashboard. He did business with us because when their cross-border freight network locked up at 2 a.m. on Thanksgiving weekend, I was the one who personally spent 5 hours rebuilding their database pipeline. Harvey Albright at Titan Global and Walter Higgins at North Star Retail felt the exact same way. In high-stakes enterprise sales, trust is not a line item you can transfer in an employee handbook. It is built through years of bulletproof execution and personal accountability. For nearly 2 decades, the founder and chairman of Vanguard, Charles Thorne, understood this fundamental reality. Charles was 64 years old, a seasoned corporate veteran who treated me with respect and allowed me complete autonomy over the enterprise portfolio. My compensation structure reflected that performance. A base salary of $240,000 per year, paired with a 3.2% annual enterprise portfolio retention bonus paid out at the end of every fiscal year. For 2026, that retention bonus amounted to exactly $1,198,000. Everything changed 6 months ago when Charles Thorne began stepping back from day-to-day operations to prepare the company for a major private equity buyout. A private firm called Sovereign Capital had issued a preliminary valuation of Vanguard at 5.5 times annual recurring revenue, placing the total corporate acquisition price at $264 million. It was the payout Charles had spent his entire lifetime building toward. Unfortunately, Charles decided to bring in his 38-year-old nephew, Brad Thorne, as the new managing director of operations to streamline management before the acquisition closed. Brad had spent his career jumping between middle management roles at failing venture-backed startups, riding on his family's corporate connections rather than actual operational competence. He arrived at our headquarters wearing designer suits, speaking in insufferable corporate buzzwords, and carrying an overwhelming sense of unearned authority. Along with Brad came his 33-year-old frat brother buddy, Mason Croft, whom Brad instantly appointed as Senior Manager of Account Operations. Mason had 0 experience in enterprise portfolio management. His primary skill set appeared to be creating flashy PowerPoint presentations that offered no substance while taking credit for work he had never touched. From his very first week on the job, Brad made it clear that he viewed my position and my compensation as a personal affront to his authority. During my first one-on-one meeting with him in his renovated corner office, he sat behind a polished mahogany desk, tapping his pen against a leather notebook without looking me in the eye. He told me, point blank that paying a single executive over $1 million in annual portfolio retention bonuses was an outdated relic of early-stage corporate compensation. He claimed that in modern corporate structures, enterprise client relationships belonged strictly to the corporate brand, not to individual directors. He insisted that the 4 Tier 1 accounts were self-sustaining systems that anyone could manage, implying that my 2 decades of work were entirely redundant. I sat quietly, watching him lay out his naive view of enterprise client management. I knew the operational realities of our contracts inside and out. I knew that enterprise clients did not renew $40 million service agreements because of a brand logo. They renewed because of dedicated executive oversight and personal covenants. But Brad was far too arrogant to listen to operational facts. He saw my impending $1.2 million retention bonus, scheduled for payout in 30 days, as money that ought to be reflected on his own management performance ledger to boost his acquisition dividend. Over the next 3 months, Brad and Mason began a systematic campaign to undermine my authority. Brad issued internal memos reassigning primary client communication channels away from my desk directly to Mason Croft. He excluded me from executive strategy sessions with Sovereign Capital's audit team, claiming that Mason represented the new dynamic face of Vanguard's leadership. Mason started emailing Leonard Ross at Apex Freight and Harvey Albright at Titan Global, offering unsolicited software overhauls without consulting my technical team. When Leonard Ross received one of Mason's clumsy emails, he called my personal cell phone within 10 minutes. Leonard asked me directly who this 33-year-old amateur was and why he was interfering with Apex Freight's system architecture. I handled the call calmly, reassuring Leonard that I was still personally overseeing their account. But I knew where the wind was blowing. Brad was setting up a corporate trap. He intended to strip me of my client relationships, force me out before my fiscal bonus vested, and hand my $37 million portfolio over to Mason Croft right as the $264 million acquisition deal reached final approval. What Brad Thorne failed to realize was that 4 years earlier, during a major contract renegotiation in 2021, I had anticipated the possibility of executive turnover and corporate hostility. With the assistance of my older brother, Lawrence Miller, a veteran contract attorney with 30 years of corporate litigation experience in Delaware commercial law, I had embedded a specific, legally binding operational clause directly into the master service agreements of all 4 Tier 1 clients. Brad believed he was playing a high-stakes game of office politics where he held all the cards. He had no idea that he was walking directly into a legal and financial minefield designed to explode the exact moment he tried to steal my life's work. By the middle of October 2026, the corporate atmosphere inside Vanguard Portfolio Tech had grown thoroughly toxic. With only 3 weeks remaining before the close of the fiscal year, Sovereign Capital was finalizing its due diligence audit for the $264 million acquisition. The private equity auditors were reviewing every contract, balance sheet, and executive compensation agreement. Brad Thorne realized that if I remained on the payroll when the audit closed, the company would be legally obligated to disburse my $1,198,000 portfolio retention bonus. Furthermore, my presence served as a constant reminder to the board that 78% of the company's revenue depended entirely on my personal management. On Monday morning of that week, Brad summoned me to a mandatory operational review in the main 9th floor conference room. Sitting next to him was Mason Croft, who had a smug expression plastered across his face. Brad didn't bother offering me coffee or exchanging pleasantries. He slid a crisp white document across the glass conference table. The document was an administrative directive requiring me to immediately turn over all administrative master keys, database access tokens, and direct personal contact protocols for Apex Freight Group, Titan Global Logistics, North Star Retail Corp., and Beacon Supply Networks. The directive specified that effective immediately, Mason Croft would assume all primary client communications and portfolio decision-making authority. I was ordered to act strictly as a secondary technical advisor until the end of the month. I picked up the document, read through the terms carefully, and looked across the table at Brad. I asked him if he had discussed this operational transition with Leonard Ross at Apex Freight or Harvey Albright at Titan Global, pointing out that enterprise service level agreements required formal written notification 30 days prior to any change in executive account leadership. Brad waved his hand dismissively, letting out a sharp, condescending chuckle. He told me that corporate leadership did not take operational orders from external clients or aging directors. He claimed that Mason Croft possessed a modern, scalable vision for digital portfolio management that would increase client margins by 15%. He stated flatly that my insistence on personal oversight was holding the company back from achieving maximum valuation before the sovereign capital buyout. I set the document down without signing it and calmly told him that changing primary key personnel without client consent placed our master service agreements at severe legal risk. Mason leaned forward, snickering under his breath, and asked if I was threatening management because I was afraid of being left behind by modern technology. I didn't reply to Mason. I simply stood up, picked up my notepad, and walked back to my office. Brad didn't take my silence as a warning. He took it as a challenge to his absolute authority. 3 days later, on Thursday afternoon at 3 o'clock, I received a calendar invitation for an emergency executive board meeting in the executive suite. When I entered the boardroom, the atmosphere was thick with calculated tension. Brad Thorne sat at the head of the table. To his right was Mason Croft, and to his left were two senior corporate HR representatives holding thick blue folders. Sitting at the far end of the table via high-definition video link was company founder Charles Thorne. Looking exhausted and visibly detached from the daily corporate squabbles, Brad stood up, adjusting his custom suit jacket, and began a scripted 15-minute presentation. He presented a series of fabricated internal metrics, claiming that my enterprise division had suffered operational inefficiencies over the preceding 2 quarters. He accused me of hoarding corporate client data, resisting modernized executive synergy, and demonstrating a severe lack of executive energy required for the company's future under sovereign capital. He formally announced to the board that management had decided to terminate my employment effective immediately for cause. By classifying the termination as for cause, Brad was attempting to strip me of all contractual severance rights, void my health coverage, and completely forfeit my vested $1,198,000 enterprise portfolio retention bonus. When Brad finished his speech, he looked at me with a triumphant smirk, clearly expecting me to lose my temper, yell, or beg Charles Thorne for mercy. Mason Croft was leaning back in his chair, taking notes with a silver pen, already eyeing my corner office. Charles Thorne spoke up briefly over the video feed, his voice sounding hesitant and compromised. He thanked me for my 22 years of service, but stated that the company needed to modernize its leadership structure ahead of the acquisition deal, deferring all operational decisions to Brad's authority. I looked at the 4 people in the room and the monitor on the wall. I felt no anger, no panic, and no desire to argue. For 22 years, I had poured my life into building Vanguard's enterprise revenue. I had worked 80-hour weeks, saved multi-million-dollar accounts from total collapse, and kept this company solvent through 3 major economic downturns. And now, an arrogant 38-year-old corporate parasite and his incompetent friend were discarding me to steal a 7-figure bonus. I reached out, took the blue termination folder from the HR representative, and read the signature line. The document explicitly stated that my access to company property, networks, and client accounts was terminated as of 5 o'clock that afternoon. Without saying a single word, I pulled my fountain pen from my jacket pocket, signed the acknowledgement of receipt, and slid the paper back across the table. Brad blinked, visibly taken aback by my complete composure. He asked if I had anything to say regarding the forfeiture of my retention bonus or the immediate transfer of client accounts. I looked Brad dead in the eye, offered a polite, faint smile, and said 2 words. "Understood, Brad." I turned around, walked out of the boardroom, and returned to my office. I spent 45 minutes packing my personal desk items, family photographs, personal legal files, and my leather-bound notebooks into a single leather briefcase. I left my corporate laptop and company cell phone neatly arranged on the center of the desk. At 4:45 p.m., as security guards shadowed me down the hallway, Mason Croft was already standing in my office doorway, directing facilities staff on where to place his new furniture. I didn't look back. At exactly 5 o'clock, I walked out of the front glass doors of Vanguard Portfolio Tech into the crisp autumn air. I opened the door of my sedan, placed my briefcase on the passenger seat, and started the engine. I picked up my personal cell phone, dialed my brother Lawrence Miller, and waited as it rang twice. When Lawrence answered, I spoke calmly into the phone. Brad pulled the trigger, Lawrence. The termination letter is signed for cause, and my bonus is officially forfeited. Activate Phase 1. On the other end of the line, Lawrence let out a low, confident laugh. I'll notify the process servers right now, Julian. By Monday morning, Vanguard's acquisition won't be worth the paper it's printed on. What Brad Thorne and the executive board of Vanguard Portfolio Tech never understood was that in high-level corporate governance, authority is not defined by a job title or a corner office. It is defined by contract structure. Back in November 2021, Vanguard had reached a critical operational crossroads. The company was pushing to lock in long-term, 5-year master service agreements with our 4 largest enterprise clients: Apex Freight Group, Titan Global Logistics, North Star Retail Corp., and Beacon Supply Networks. Together, these 4 clients represented $37,440,000 in annual recurring revenue. At the time, the chief executive officers of those client corporations, Leonard Ross, Harvey Albright, Walter Higgins, and Richard Vance, expressed deep anxiety over corporate instability at Vanguard. They were concerned that Vanguard might eventually be sold to an inexperienced private equity firm or fall under the control of incompetent executive management that would ruin their operational supply chain infrastructure. They made it crystal clear to founder Charles Thorne that they would only sign 5-year enterprise agreements under one strict condition: that I, Julian Miller, personally retained absolute executive control over their portfolio architecture, service delivery protocols, and account management. To satisfy the clients, Charles Thorne had authorized me and my legal counsel, my brother Lawrence Miller, to draft a specialized master addendum. We crafted Clause 14B, formerly titled the Keyman Portfolio Assignment and Unilateral Exit Covenant, governed strictly under 41 U.S.C. Section 6503 regarding performance breach remedies and Delaware General Corporation Law. Section 122 regarding executive indemnification and portfolio assignment. Clause 14B contained 3 devastating legal covenants that Brad Thorne had completely overlooked when he reviewed my employment contract. First, under subsection 14B1, the master agreements explicitly defined Julian Miller as the designated key person of enterprise governance. The contract stated that any involuntary termination, demotion, or restriction of Julian Miller's executive oversight without prior written consent from all 4 client board of directors constituted an immediate material breach of the master service agreement by Vanguard Portfolio Tech. Second, under subsection 14B2, upon such a material breach, all 4 enterprise clients possess the absolute legal right to immediately halt all recurring monthly billing payments, freeze data API pipelines, and issue a 30-day unilateral contract termination notice with 0 financial penalty or exit fees. Third, and most importantly, under subsection 14B3, the clause granted the 4 enterprise clients the unilateral authority to assign their entire portfolio servicing contract, operational database governance, and account management rights directly to any independent legal entity established or operated by Julian Miller. In addition to Clause 14B, I held proprietary copyright rights under 17 U.S.C. Section 106 for the specialized multi-tenant client data integration middleware that I had personally authored and registered under my own name back in 2012, licensing it to Vanguard under a revocable enterprise usage agreement tied directly to my active employment. Brad Thorne had assumed that because Vanguard was a multi-million-dollar corporation, the clients belonged to the company by default. He had signed my termination letter without ever reading the underlying master service agreements housed in our secure legal database. On Friday morning, Less than 16 hours after my walkout, I sat inside the sunlit conference room of Miller and Associates law offices on Michigan Avenue in downtown Chicago. Sitting around the granite conference table were Leonard Ross of Apex Freight, Harvey Albright of Titan Global, and Walter Higgins of North Star Retail. Joining us via secure video link was Richard Vance of Beacon Supply Networks. Lawrence Miller stood at the head of the room, handing each chief executive officer a legal briefing folder containing a copy of my signed termination letter from Brad Thorne. When Leonard Ross read Brad's written claim that I was being terminated for lacking executive energy, and that Mason Croft was taking over Apex Freight's account, Leonard slammed his fist onto the table, so hard his coffee cup rattled. "That arrogant little nepotism baby actually fired you?" Leonard barked, his face turning red with outrage. "We explicitly told Charles Thorne 5 years ago that our $37 million in business stays with Julian Miller. I wouldn't trust this Mason kid to manage a lemonade stand, let alone our cross-border logistics network." Harvey Albright nodded in sharp agreement. Titan Global processes 90,000 freight manifests a day through Julian's proprietary database pipeline. If Vanguard thinks they can push us around and hand our core data to a 33-year-old amateur, they are out of their minds. Lawrence Miller stepped forward, sliding 4 sets of formal legal notices across the table. "Gentlemen," Lawrence said calmly, "under Clause 14B of your master service agreements, Vanguard Portfolio Tech committed a material breach. The second Brad Thorne signed Julian's termination notice yesterday afternoon. You have the full legal right to execute your unilateral exit notices today, freeze all recurring revenue payments to Vanguard, and execute an immediate portfolio transfer to Miller Strategic Advisory LLC, Julian's new independent consulting firm." Without a second's hesitation, Leonard Ross uncapped his pen and signed the notice for Apex Freight. Harvey Albright, Walter Higgins, and Richard Vance followed immediately. By 11 o'clock Friday morning, all 4 Tier 1 enterprise clients had officially executed their Clause 14B termination notices. Simultaneously, Lawrence dispatched formal legal cease and desist orders to Vanguard's corporate headquarters under 17 U.S.C. Section 106, revoking Vanguard's license to utilize my proprietary data integration middleware effective as of midnight on Sunday. While Brad Thorne was uncorking champagne in his office, celebrating my departure and planning his upcoming buyout payout, the legal fuse had been lit. On Monday morning, when the financial markets opened, Vanguard Portfolio Tech was about to hit a brick wall at 200 miles per hour. On Monday morning at 8:30, the executive floor of Vanguard Portfolio Tech was prepared for a celebration. Brad Thorne had ordered catering for a high-profile breakfast meeting in the 9th floor executive boardroom. In attendance were Charles Thorne, Mason Croft, Vanguard's senior board members, and Alan Chambers, the lead acquisition auditor from Sovereign Capital. Brad stood at the front of the room with a laser pointer, presenting a slide deck detailing how management had successfully streamlined enterprise operations by removing high-cost legacy directors and transitioning the 4 major accounts directly under Mason Croft's supervision. At exactly 9 o'clock, 4 uniformed process servers walked past the reception desk, bypassed executive security, and marched directly into the boardroom. They handed Brad Thorne 4 heavy legal envelopes stamped with red corporate litigation seals. Brad chuckled nervously, telling Alan Chambers that it was likely routine administrative paperwork, before tearing open the first envelope from Apex Freight Group. As his eyes scanned the formal legal notice signed by Leonard Ross, the color drained entirely from Brad's face. The notice explicitly stated that Apex Freight was invoking Clause 14B of their master service agreement due to Vanguard's material breach and terminating key person Julian Miller. Effective immediately, Apex Freight was suspending all monthly service payments of $935,000 and issuing a 30-day contract eviction notice. Before Brad could even process the document, he opened the remaining 3 envelopes from Titan Global Logistics, North Star Retail Corp., and Beacon Supply Networks. All 3 letters contained identical legal notices invoking Clause 14B and halting all billing. At 9:15 morning, the entire operational floor went into red alert. Red warning banners flashed across every terminal in the Software Operations Center. Julian's proprietary multi-tenant database middleware, which routed real-time inventory and freight manifests for all 4 enterprise clients, had executed an automatic license revocation protocol pursuant to the cease and desist order under 17 U.S.C. Section 106. Mason Croft ran frantically into the operations room, screaming at the senior software engineers to override the system lock. But the lead engineer turned around, looked at Mason with complete contempt, and informed him that the underlying encryption keys were held on an off-site physical hardware token registered exclusively to Julian Miller. Without Julian's personal administrative signature, the entire enterprise data pipeline was completely dark. Overnight, Vanguard Portfolio Tech lost $37,440,000 of its $48 million revenue stream. 78% of the company's annual recurring revenue had vanished in less than 15 minutes. Alon Chambers, the lead auditor from Sovereign Capital, stood up from the boardroom table, closed his leather notebook, and turned to founder Charles Thorne. "Charles," Alan Chambers said in a cold, brutal tone, "your managing director represented to our buyout committee that Vanguard's enterprise portfolio was fully secure and turnkey. You just lost nearly 80% of your revenue because your nephew fired the single executive who held the client covenants. Sovereign Capital is immediately terminating the $264 million acquisition deal. Furthermore, our legal department is evaluating whether to file formal securities fraud charges against Vanguard's board for misrepresenting key person risk during due diligence." With those words, Alan Chambers and his entire audit team packed their bags and walked out of the building. The valuation of Vanguard Portfolio Tech crashed from $264 million down to $58 million in a single morning. Complete chaos erupted inside the executive offices. Board members were yelling at Charles Thorne, demanding to know how a 38-year-old managing director could be foolish enough to sign a termination letter without checking the master service agreements. Charles turned on Brad in a rage, demanding that Brad fix the situation immediately or face a total shareholder lawsuit. Starting at 10 o'clock Monday morning, Brad Thorne began calling my personal cell phone. Over the next 48 hours, my phone logged exactly 103 missed calls from Brad, along with 27 frantic emails from Mason Croft begging me to come back for an urgent operational consultation. Brad's messages shifted rapidly from aggressive corporate posturing to desperate pleading. He offered to double my salary, reinstate my title, and grant me immediate executive equity if I would simply return to the office, unlock the database pipeline, and convince Leonard Ross and Harvey Albright to rescind their Clause 14B termination notices. I didn't answer a single call, and I didn't reply to a single email. I spent Monday and Tuesday playing golf with my brother Lawrence, taking long walks by the lake, and finalizing the corporate incorporation papers for Miller Strategic Advisory LLC. By Tuesday evening, Leonard Ross, Harvey Albright, Walter Higgins, and Richard Vance had all signed formal service management agreements with Miller Strategic Advisory LLC, transferring their entire $37 million enterprise portfolio management over to my new firm. Finally, on Wednesday morning at 9 a.m., Lawrence Miller sent a single formal email response to Brad Thorne and Charles Thorne. The email stated that Julian Miller would agree to a single 30-minute meeting at Lawrence Miller's law office on Wednesday afternoon at 2 o'clock. However, the email made one condition absolute. Brad Thorne and Charles Thorne had to bring written, board-certified corporate power of attorney granting them full binding authority to sign a total legal settlement. If they failed to meet our terms by 2:30 p.m., the portfolio transfer to Miller Strategic Advisory LLC would become final and irrevocable under Delaware state law. At 2 o'clock on Wednesday afternoon, the main conference room of Miller and Associates was dead silent. I sat at the head of the polished granite table next to my brother Lawrence. Sitting across from us were founder Charles Thorne and his nephew Brad Thorne. The transformation in Brad over 68 hours was staggering. The arrogant 38-year-old managing director who had swaggered into the boardroom 6 days ago to fire me was completely gone. His eyes were bloodshot, his tie was loosened, and his hands trembled slightly as he set his leather briefcase onto the table. Charles Thorne looked 10 years older, his face etched with heavy fatigue and regret. Brad cleared his throat, trying to adopt a conciliatory tone. He looked across the table at me, forcing a strained smile. "Julian," Brad began, his voice raspy, "we know things got out of hand last week. High-stakes corporate transitions can cause misunderstandings. Charles and I have discussed this with the board. We are willing to reinstate your position immediately as Vice President of Enterprise Portfolios. We will issue your $1.2 million bonus today, grant you 50,000 corporate stock options, and give you complete autonomy over the client accounts. We just need you to sign the system encryption release today and call Leonard Ross and Harvey Albright to rescind those termination notices." I didn't answer. I simply looked at Lawrence, who reached into his leather portfolio and pulled out a 4-page legal document titled Master Settlement Agreement and General Release. Lawrence slid 2 copies across the table to Charles and Brad. "Brad," Lawrence said in a firm, measured tone, "my client is not returning to Vanguard Portfolio Tech under any circumstances. You terminated Julian for cause, forfeited his bonus, and attempted to seize his 22 years of client relationships for your own personal financial gain. The time for corporate reconciliation ended at 5 o'clock last Thursday." Lawrence tapped his pen on the top page of the agreement, outlining our non-negotiable settlement terms. First, Vanguard Portfolio Tech must disburse full cash payment of Julian's vested 2026 Enterprise Portfolio Retention Bonus in the exact amount of $1,198,000. Second, pursuant to Executive Employment Clause 8B regarding wrongful termination without cause, Vanguard must pay a double multiplier severance package consisting of 24 months base salary equal to $480,000 plus $2,400,000 in liquidated breach damages, bringing the total severance payout to $2,880,000. Third, total cash settlement payable immediately via wire transfer to Julian Miller's escrow account equals exactly $4,078,000. Fourth, Vanguard's Board of Directors must execute a complete, unconditional legal release and non-disparagement covenant, officially waiving all non-compete agreements and approving the transfer of servicing rights for Apex Freight, Titan Global, North Star Retail, and Beacon Supply directly to Miller Strategic Advisory LLC. Brad's jaw dropped. $4 million in cash? Plus, you take 78% of our enterprise revenue? That will bankrupt our operational reserves. The board will never approve this. Charles Thorne held up his hand, silencing his nephew instantly. Charles looked across the table at me, his eyes filled with profound realization. "Julian," Charles said softly, "if we sign this, Vanguard survives on its remaining $10 million in small market ARR, but our acquisition buyout is dead." "If we don't sign this, what happens?" Lawrence answered immediately. "If you don't sign by 2:30 p.m. today, our process servers will file 4 separate breach of contract lawsuits in Delaware Chancery Court on behalf of the 4 enterprise client boards. The public filings will detail Brad Thorne's gross operational negligence, which will trigger emergency shareholder derivative suits against Vanguard's entire board of directors. Within 48 hours, Vanguard will be in involuntary Chapter 11 bankruptcy." Charles Thorne closed his eyes for 10 seconds, taking a deep, shuddering breath. He knew Lawrence wasn't bluffing. He knew that every word of the legal addendum I drafted in 2021 was ironclad. Charles picked up his pen, looked at Brad with cold fury, and said, "You destroyed a $250 million enterprise because you thought you were smarter than a man who spent 22 years building it." Without another word, Charles Thorne signed all 4 copies of the Master Settlement Agreement on behalf of Vanguard's Board of Directors. He then grabbed Brad's arm, pushed the pen into his nephew's hand, and forced him to sign as managing director. The moment the final signature was affixed, Charles turned to Brad and delivered the final blow. "Brad, effective right now, the board has voted to terminate your employment as managing director for gross breach of fiduciary duty. You and Mason Croft have 30 minutes to clear your personal belongings from the building under security escort." The board's legal team will be filing recovery suits against you for corporate waste. Brad sat frozen in his chair, completely speechless, staring at his signed name on the document that ended his corporate career. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, a certified wire transfer of $4,078,000 cleared into my corporate escrow account. 6 months later, Miller Strategic Advisory LLC opened its new executive offices on the top floor of a high-rise tower overlooking Lake Michigan in downtown Chicago. Sitting in our spacious, sunlit conference room were Leonard Ross, Harvey Albright, Walter Higgins, and Richard Vance. All 4 enterprise clients had seamlessly transitioned their $37,440,000 in annual recurring contracts over to my firm. My technical team had deployed a modern, expanded software infrastructure, and our client retention rate remained at 100%. As I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over the city skyline, sipping a warm cup of black coffee, I thought about Brad Thorne and the arrogance that brought him down. In the corporate world, titles are given on paper, but real power is earned through dedicated work, unbreakable client trust, and bulletproof legal preparation. When arrogant executives try to steal your life's work, you don't need to yell or cause a scene. You simply let the legal covenants execute, step back in silence, and watch the house of cards collapse under its own weight. Da Viet Huan Ching.